by Wafsi, Rosen, Kweskin, and Karansky, and we're just delighted to work with them. And tonight, Steve Frederick, who's also chair of the Library Foundation Board, but a managing partner, will be introducing the next portion.
Thanks, Alice. So, good evening, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight, not only as a co-managing partner of Wafsi Rosen and as a current trustee of the library board, but also as somebody who worked many years with Howard Kaplan. Howard Kaplan was somebody who really promoted the idea that lawyers should give back to society because of a lawyer's special role in making laws and helping to enforce laws. It was something that every young lawyer at Wafsi Rosen needed to do. And all of the volunteer work I've done over the course of 30-some odd years that I've been in Stanford is largely a tribute to Howard Kaplan, as many lawyers at my firm have done, contributed and volunteered. Howard, as many of you know, was an elected official. He was on the Board of Reps. He was a majority leader. He was a founding member of Stanford's Board of Ethics. He served on innumerable boards. And this is an apt tribute. This lecture series on law and society is an apt tribute to Howard. Tonight, we're going to talk about affordable housing. And we have Richard Friedman speaking. And we have Anika Singh Lamar speaking. Richard, I'm looking around. When you say that someone doesn't need an introduction, usually, you know, that's a joke, right? There's nobody in this room who doesn't know who Richard Friedman is in garden home management and all the things that he's done for Stanford, including, you know, chairing the Board of Finance and all the education things that he's done. And his company, founded by his father, I believe, has been around for quite a long time, and they have something like 9,000 housing units, many of them affordable. And he is going to be presenting tonight from the perspective of a developer. Anika Singh Lamar is a clinical professor at Yale Law School, and she's going to be presenting from the legal perspective, the lawyer's perspective. Now, if you look on the website, you would think this was going to be a debate between the two, only because that's what it said on the website. So I was like looking forward to a real fight tonight, and I was preparing remarks as if it was going to be a real fight, and I was very interested, and then I learned 5 minutes ago it's actually not going to be a debate. They should really be on the same side. So for those who wanted a good fight, sorry about that. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Kaplan to say a few words as well, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Steve. Hi, I'm Jennifer Kaplan. I'm Howard Kaplan's youngest daughter. I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to the Ferguson Library, and most especially to say thank you for Wafsi Rosen, which I know when they founded this lecture series in my father's honor, they might not have understood that they were also underwriting a family reunion for the Kaplans. We love coming here. I also want to particularly thank David Cohn, who I sense may shoulder the lion's share of work putting this lecture series together. But anyway, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to remember my father. He would love this. Also, as a daughter, I don't know if you guys realize this, as children, we tend to only think of our parents as the person they are at home, as a father, a grandfather, a husband, and we love to remember my father that way, but this is such a wonderful opportunity to remember my father, who was like the lawyer and the pillar of the community, and I just want to thank everyone so much for being here.
Good evening, everyone. It's really my honor and my pleasure to be here this evening. When David Cohn originally asked me if I would like to speak on affordable housing, it's supposed to be related to the law, right? Because Howard was a lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer. So, but I did attend the first lecture between Justice McDonald and Dan Young, and they had a very nice back and forth, and I thought that was a really nice format, and I thought, I have the perfect person. Professor Anika Lamar from Yale Law School. We have collaborated for many years on various affordable housing issues, one of which we'll talk about this evening. And so I'm going to run through maybe a very brief presentation to kind of give you some background. And then when I'm done, we're going to both sit there and we'll have a discussion about various topics in Connecticut around affordable housing and the current state of the law. It's the up arrow, down. Okay, there we go. What's law got to do with it? Well, it's got a lot to do with it, as we'll talk about. So Connecticut has an affordable housing deficit of 89,000 units. This is calculated by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. This is a very conservative number. So this is the lowest income people paying the highest amount for housing expenses. So there are broader definitions of this number that could be as high as 300,000. So this is a very, very conservative number as to what the affordable housing shortage is right now in Connecticut. And we build hardly any housing. So we have a deficit of 89,000 units, but we only build about 4,000 units a year. And on a per capita basis, that makes us 49 out of 50 states. We build 1.3 units of housing per 1,000 residents. Number one is Utah. They build almost 10 times as much, 12 units per 1,000 people. Even New York, which is thought of as being kind of slow growth, is almost triple what we are. So the affordable housing that we do have is concentrated and it's segregated. So the red dots represent generally public housing, and you can see that the dots are clustered in the areas of the map that are white. And the areas of the map that are white are the areas that are, you can't really see it on the key, the non-Hispanic white population of the white areas is under 72%. So the green areas are whiter, and the white areas are higher percentages of people of color. And you can see that the red dots are clustered in places like, well, Stamford, Norwalk, Bridgeport, New Haven, West Haven, Danbury, Hartford, Middletown. I mean, I'm not going to recite every town on the map, but you can see there are actually areas of the map that have almost no dots at all, right? So like this huge swath of northwestern Connecticut has essentially no public housing. New Canaan has one, Darien has one, Westport has two. So the affordable housing that we do have has functioned from generations of public policy, interlocking public policies, to its function to concentrate people of color, segregate them, and segregate people by their incomes. Now, ironically, low-paying jobs are co-located with high-cost housing. So what you see on the right, you may need your binoculars, is that I have the most common job descriptions for New Canaan, Darien, and Stamford. And you can see that the average income in New Canaan and Darien is quite a bit less than it is in Stamford. Let me just get this. You'll see that every one of these towns has one job category, finance and insurance, that's disproportionately higher than the rest. And if you take that out, what you see is that in a town in New Canaan and Darien, the vast majority, in fact, all of the most common job categories don't pay well. So healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, these are restaurant workers, home healthcare workers. So the average income for these workers in these towns, $30,000, $54,000, right? So towns like New Canaan and Darien are full of low-paying jobs. Stamford actually has much higher paying jobs. And then you see what the median home values are in these towns, and it's a complete mismatch. So people who live in expensive houses purchase a high level of service. Those services require low-paying jobs, and the people providing those services cannot live in those towns. So it's largely a function at this point in time of zoning. So you can see in Connecticut, percentage multifamily, percentage rental, percent below poverty line, percent Black population, percent Hispanic population. So you see the average for Connecticut, you see what Stamford is, and then you see what New Canaan, Darien, and Westport are. So the reason that the percentage of multifamily housing in these towns is so low is because you can't build it anywhere in those towns. That's purely a function of their zoning. This zoning has been in place for really a century, and it's had the function of essentially zoning out multifamily housing, which is predominantly rental, and it has the effect of zoning out poverty and people of color. So people think that zoning is like handed down from the gods. I guess the Jews wandered in Canaan, or this is either the New Canaan or the Canaan town zoning. I'm not sure which one. It's kind of this free-floating thing, you know, it's like we just have it. Well, we don't. I mean, zoning is zoning is a police power of the state of Connecticut, and it's delegated to the towns. And the first state statute enabling town zoning was in 1923. And today it's known as the Zoning Enabling Act, Connecticut General Statutes 8-2, and it says some of the damnedest things. It says, see if can you help me out here? Towns shall make provision for housing opportunity for low and moderate income families in the region, right? Okay, so I got that close. That's what 8-2 says that. This is a law that's on the books. It says that right now, but it's never been enforced, right? So, so here's an example of exclusionary zoning. The town of Woodbridge. So in 1933, so this is 10 years after zoning came into being, 98.4% of the town was owned single family. And at the time, the minimum lot size was about a half an acre. That wasn't enough. 6 years later, they tripled the minimum lot size. That wasn't enough. 25 years later, they increased the minimum lot size to 1.5 acres. In 2001, they increased the minimum lot size in most of the town to 2 acres. At that point, it was kind of irrelevant because most of the lots had already been built on. But this is just one example. Many towns have the zoning history of many towns in Connecticut essentially mirrors this, and you can see it. So in 1940, Woodbridge had a population of about 2,200, and it was mostly vacant land. 40 years later, the population more than tripled to about 7,800, and that's a growth rate of 3.1% a year. So what was going on in that 40-year period? Well, it was the suburbanization of Connecticut, right? There's a lot of vacant land. People were moving out of not just New York City, but our cities, Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury. Every city in Connecticut, the population is lower now than it was in World War II, other than Stamford. New Haven used to be 160,000 people. Now it's 120,000 or 130. Hartford has been losing population for decades. So where did all these people go? Well, they went to places like Woodbridge. And by 1980, because Woodbridge had the whole town zone, 1.5 acres, by 1980, the town was built out, quote unquote. So all the land got used up. After 1980, there was no land left to build on. It had all been built out with single-family homes, and the population didn't really grow very much in the last 40 years. That's intentional, right? So when you hear discussions about, well, we don't have the infrastructure to support more people, to support more housing. Well, they certainly had the infrastructure for 40 years. I mean, you want to move into a single-family house on 1.5 acres? Come on in. We'll build your roads, we'll build your schools, we'll build your parks. Once all those lots are used up, though, you're not welcome anymore. So the population trends in New Canaan and Darien, pretty much the same thing, right? There weren't very many people in 1940, lots of vacant land. They grew rapidly over the next 40 years. And then in the last 40 years, the land has essentially been used up. I think something like 80% of New Canaan is zoned either 2 or 4 acre, and most of Darien is zoned either 1 or 2 acre. And this trend, you could find any number of towns in Connecticut. Some are a little later, some are a little earlier, the growth rates are a little different, but they're all very similar. Guilford, Madison, Bethany, Glastonbury, Avon, Farmington, right? The list goes on and on and on and on. Ridgefield, certainly most of the towns around here. So, with that, I will invite Nika up to the stage. I think we have 2 mics there. So if the problem is zoning, right? Right now we only have really one tool, right? And it's 830G. Now in Stamford, if you say 830G, people look at you like you have 3 heads. Most people don't even know what it is. If you were to walk down the street in New Canaan and say 830G, you'd probably be attacked by an angry mob. Why don't you walk us through what 830G is?
Sure, happy to, and it's nice to see everyone here tonight. Thank you all for having me. Let me start by saying that 830G is a Connecticut statute, but it's not alone. There are examples from other places in the country of states that have similar laws on the books. And in fact, Connecticut's 830G, what we call the Affordable Housing Land Use Appeals Act, is modeled on a much better named Massachusetts statute. There it's Section 40B, and they just straight up call it the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. So it's much better. So Connecticut adopted 830G in 1989, again, based on this Massachusetts statute that had at that point been in place for 20 years. And what it says is that if in your town, fewer than 10% of the total units, residential units, are considered affordable, as defined in the statute, then somebody who's looking to build affordable housing need not comply with the local zoning, which is assumed to be snob zoning. And so long as that development would not negatively impact health and safety, that the town must issue zoning approvals. So that's the one tool we've had in Connecticut since 1989 to deal with the suite of problems that Richard has described. There are similar tools in other states. That's the Connecticut version.
So thank you for your very illuminating description. It sounds so good in the telling, right? I mean, when you describe it, it sounds so great. But it's not so great in the using. So I have, I think, used 830G 10 times, and I have been in litigation, I believe, 8 times. So the towns a long time ago figured out how to frustrate the purposes of the law, and it's created a ton of litigation and some very impressive case law, but not that much housing. So, what do you see as what do you think the problems with the law have been?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think there are at least a few things. So the first of which is the time of litigation. So 830G requires you to go to court. So when the local land use body says no, the next step is Connecticut Superior Court. That's not how the Massachusetts statute works, but it is how the Connecticut statute works. And litigation takes a long time. And what we call the pre-development process is expensive. You've basically got to hold on to a piece of land and pay for it while you're waiting to see whether you can build the thing that you want to build. So that timeline and the risk, right? Because not every 830G lawsuit brought by a developer is won. Sometimes you lose. Sometimes the court finds that there was a health and safety issue. So that's the simple cost, the delay of litigation. I think notwithstanding the ways in which some of these towns will talk about predatory developers or most developers are not in the business of litigation. It's not part of their business model and it's not something they see themselves doing. They'd much rather build sort of more low-hanging fruit. And so if you can, instead of going to court to build the much more environmentally friendly 200 units near the New Canaan train station, you can instead go to someplace and build tract homes on, tract homes where you're not going to, on farmland where no one's going to put up a fight, then you're going to do the latter rather than the former. So that's what we've seen in Connecticut is that most folks are not willing to take on the fight.
It's used relatively little in my experience. The largest developers in Connecticut, even the next tier down, won't use it. They'll build in places where they can get their approvals, places like Norwalk, places like Stamford, places like New Haven, where the land use process is more predictable, but they're not going to go to a place like New Canaan where they could be tied up in litigation for 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Or they'll do that for a long time. They would do that suburban tract housing, which is just there's less demand for it now, so you see less of it. But yeah.
The other thing is, I think there's no benefit, particularly on a planning and zoning commission. There's no political benefit to approving a project.
Yeah. So, and I think this comes back to a fundamental problem. So the question posed by the name of the presentation is, what does law have to do with it? And one thing that law has to do with it is zoning, because the law tells you what you can build where. But the other thing that the law famously does is it divvies up responsibility between local government, state government, federal government, for various aspects of what we understand to be the kind of rules and laws that govern our lives. And because the zoning happens locally, the local officials are only beholden to people who live in their town, and within that subset, people who vote for local office, which, as we know, is like famously undemocratic because voter turnout is very low at the local level, as opposed to state and federal offices where you have more, you have better turnout. So if you're a planning and zoning commissioner and you're faced with voting for a development, chances are, just by the function of the fact that we live in a state with 169 tiny little towns, chances are the person proposing the development in front of you does not live in your town. Just not because they're like out of state terrible people, but because, there's 169 towns. So if they live 5 miles away, they live 2 towns away. So the person building it doesn't live in the town. The people working on the project, like the people who would benefit from the labor of working in it, probably don't live in your town. The people who are going to live in the development, well, you don't know who they are. They're just, it's like an inchoate mass of like, who knows who that's gonna be. They don't live in your town, as far as you know. The only person showing up are the people who are currently in your town who, for a variety of reasons, both economic and human nature, are very afraid of change. And the only people who show up at planning and zoning hearings, and I am one of them, and for those of you who wanted a debate tonight, Richard and I can find you a planning and zoning hearing in the region in the near future where you can hear people yell at each other, no problem. The only people who show up to these things who are not being paid to show up to them are like a little bit crazy. And I'm one of them. Like, I testified at a zoning hearing in my neighborhood a week ago that was not my client. I did it just because I wanted to be in favor of this housing development. You have to have time. You have to have childcare. You have to have transportation. You have to know that it's happening, right? So you, as a planning and zoning commissioner, you're sitting up there and you're only hearing from people who are against a project. So from a political perspective, yes, it's almost a given that so long as the decision making is at the local level, that the answer is going to be no more frequently than it's yes, and certainly more frequently than it ought to be. And that's structural. That's structural. I don't think you can correct. We can talk about but I'm not sure you can correct that so long as that decision-making authority rests exclusively at the local level.
So 830G has something called a moratorium provision, which is that if you're exempt from the law if you get to the full 10%, but if you build some smaller number, you can exempt your town for 4 years. Right, and so for 4 years, your town would not be subject to developments proposed under 830G. And those, in some cases, have been pretty effective in motivating towns to build affordable housing, which I think that means that sticks work, right, and carrots don't. So if you look, there was a requirement under Connecticut state law that towns file affordable housing plans, and most of the plans around here, one of the strategies, and I'm talking New Canaan, Darien, Fairfield, Wilton, Westport, all of those plans have one of the strategies is to get a moratorium under 830G, right? Which I didn't know that was a planning regimen, but so. When it works, when 830G works, it does create some amazing housing. So if you could just turn the projector on for a second. Thank you. So this was a project that we just finished in Oxford. It's a manufactured housing community. It took 11 years of litigation and ultimately the intervention of the Federal Department of Justice to get this approved by the town of Oxford. It's a little neighborhood. These are the streets. These are some of the streetscapes. It's all single family homes. And it's a neighborhood. People live there. The kids play in the street. There's a lot of school children in this development, I'm happy to report. And when you build a place, you get to name the streets. So Jessica is one of my children. Alua is not one of my children. That's Affordable Housing Land Use Appeals Act. You could turn that off. So we need something better, right? And there's been a lot of talk about this for many years. So in this last, well, actually it started 2 legislative sessions ago, but it really heated up in the last legislative session. There was something called Fair Share proposed, and it made it out of committee. And why don't, if you could describe that, what it was.
Yeah, so, as you probably guessed, this is not a Connecticut-specific problem. We do it really well, better than most, but it's not a Connecticut-specific problem. And the concept of, and there's a number of different state-level, for the reasons I just described, where you cannot solve this problem at the local level. There are a number of states that are trying different sorts of interventions and have, over the years, but there's a burst of activity now because the housing crisis has gotten so bad. Fair share is actually a concept that's been in place since the 60s in the state of New Jersey, and since the 80s under a different name in the state of California. And more recently now, it's spread to the state of Oregon as well as of about a year ago. And the concept is that the housing shortage and the housing affordability crises are statewide problems. They're state problems, right? So New Canaan can exist quite nicely, notwithstanding a statewide housing crisis, right? They can basically import their labor from people who live in low-income housing in other towns. It doesn't bother them. But it bothers the state. It registers at the state level that there are employers who won't move here because they know they can't hire people at wages that they can afford to pay. Bothers the state that they've got to pay rental assistance for people who can't otherwise afford housing, that there's a homelessness crisis, that they've got to pay for shelters, and they've got to pay for children who are in school who are homeless, and the extra expenses. The state feels the crisis in a way that local governments don't. So at the state level, you see these varying solutions. In New Jersey, as a result of litigation brought by the NAACP of New Jersey and some others, the New Jersey courts kind of pointed to some language in the New Jersey Constitution that says that the police power, which is that power that zoning comes from, has to be exercised in pursuit of the general welfare. And the general welfare isn't New Canaan's general welfare, it's the state's general welfare. So if you're going to have local zoning authority, that's fine, but they've got to do it in a way that it meets their obligations to the region. And so the process set up in New Jersey in order to effectuate this case law was that the state essentially calculates a number of what that affordable housing shortage is, and then uses a formula to allocate responsibility for not construction, but permitting the construction of those units to towns across the state. And that there's then a process for confirming that the zoning permits the construction of those units. Again, it doesn't require that the towns construct those units. So that's the New Jersey model of fair share, and it varies a little bit from state to state. In California and Oregon, they don't call it fair share, they call it a regional housing needs allocation, which is fairly descriptive, if a mouthful. The Connecticut statute, the Connecticut bill would seek to do something similar in Connecticut.
So the bill was proposed last year in earnest, right? There was a calculation of the fair share allocation for every town, right? I believe the fair share allocation for, I think it was highest for Greenwich, I want to say. It was almost 2,000 affordable units. For the towns around here, Darien, New Canaan, Westport, I think the allocation was about 1,200 affordable units, which would really make a dent in the problem. And the big difference that I saw was that, so it gave local control, right? That's sort of that's the clarion call of these towns. We want local control, we want local control, we want local control. It gave them local control, right? We're just giving you a number, you have to figure it out. But if they didn't meet the number on a certain time frame, there was real enforcement, which is different than 830G, right? 830G is just lawsuits from one at a time from individual developers. And the enforcement was default zoning, right? So what happened?
I mean, so what happened last session is something that happens a lot in Connecticut, which is, well, one, it's a suburban state, right? So for a lot of towns, particularly around here, I mean, I will say this fight is very much concentrated in this corner of the state. There was a great deal of opposition, and some very naysaying, fear-mongering advocacy conducted in opposition to the proposal. And we'll talk a little bit about what other states have done, and you'll see that they don't permit that local control flexibility the same way that Fair Share does. But a lot of opposition saying that that this would it would bring skyscrapers to farmland and eviscerate local control. And the compromise result out of the Connecticut General Assembly was what we call a study bill, which is essentially saying, well, we'll study the idea. We'll get back to you all on how that goes. Study bills can be productive places where ideas grow and concepts later then come back for passage by the Connecticut General Assembly. They can also be places where good bills go to die and get studied forever.
So, and it was not supported by the governor.
It was not outwardly supported by the governor.
So what do you see as the prognosis, since so much of the legislature represents suburban and rural towns in the state?
Yeah, I mean, so my perspective on this, both when it comes to Connecticut and to some degree when it comes to other states, is simultaneously optimistic and pessimistic. What we've seen in other places is that eventually things get so bad that people are forced to act. And we're in a place right now where the housing affordability crisis has gotten so bad that I don't think people can really ignore it. It's not the first time we've been in this place. 1989, when the 830G came into being, was one of those moments where the housing affordability crisis had gotten so bad that something needed to be done about it. But it is one of those moments. So I think I do think there is at least a chance that more and more, even suburban legislators, even if they don't feel the crisis in their personal pocketbooks, will see it because their children are facing it, because homelessness is rising in the state of Connecticut after a very long period of very, very successful measures to decrease homelessness to almost zero in the state. By zero, I mean that you did not have people who are perpetually homeless. You had people who are emergency homeless, but then we were able to find housing for them. We were one of the few states in the country that brought veteran homelessness literally down to zero, and now it's going up again. That's a housing affordability crisis, right? So if to the extent that I'm optimistic about this, it's because I'm pessimistic that things will continue to get worse and more people will be forced to action and won't be able to ignore the problem. Now, will that happen soon enough for that to work? I mean, I don't know.
So it was supported by the legislative leadership. So Matt Ritter, who's the House Speaker, and this is a quote from a newspaper article, Matt Ritter suggested that zoning reform may have to be accomplished through the courts rather than the state legislature. So that brings us to the Open Communities Trust and the Garden Homes Fund versus the town of Woodbridge. So this actually started, I was at a somewhat low period after I had lost actually I'd lost zoning litigation in Westport, and I got very frustrated. And I concluded that the project by project approach, which is what 830G enables, it just doesn't work. It just creates, there's just too many ways to stop it, as we've discussed. So I had this idea, which is that what if you could change the zoning in an entire town, and you would change it so that you would honor the single family zoning in a particular, wherever it happened to be, height of the building, the size of the building, whatever the parameters were for the single family structure in that part of town. But inside that building, you could build as many units as you wanted. And I got this idea actually from biking down Oak Ridge Road in New Canaan, where I thought that the houses looked like they were the size of small apartment buildings. So I called Aaron Boggs, who's the executive director of the Open Communities Alliance, which is a housing justice nonprofit in Hartford, and she called you, and maybe you should take it from there.
Yeah, so I get nervous talking about pending litigation, but I'll describe the suit that we filed last fall against the town of Woodbridge.
Well, it started as a zoning application.
Started as a
right?
zoning application, but that's too in the weeds, I think, for 7:15 in the evening. So the lawsuit against the town of Woodbridge points out that 98.6% of the town is zoned for single family only on large lots, and then makes the claim, well-founded, I think, that zoning statute, not just including not just that single family only, but the zoning ordinance violates various aspects of primarily Connecticut law. So one is that the Connecticut Constitution actually includes an anti-segregation clause. It's one of just 2 or 3 states where the state constitution has not just an equal protection that you cannot discriminate, but actually an anti-segregation, which is to say that we are supposed to undo segregation clause in its constitution. And for a variety of reasons having to do with the way in which this country has enacted racial discrimination in law, that class-based policies like large lot, exclusionary, single-family only zoning have a segregative effect. So one thing is a citation to the Connecticut Constitution. It also relies on the Connecticut Fair Housing Act for similar reasons. The Connecticut Fair Housing Act looks a lot like the Federal Fair Housing Act with a couple of additional provisions. And then it points to the straightforward language that Richard cited earlier that's in the Connecticut Zoning Enabling Act, that local town zoning is supposed to, shall, address economic diversity, multifamily housing, economic opportunity, and that simply is not. You can't make the argument with a straight face that that's what Woodbridge's zoning does. That's the case pending in Connecticut Superior Court.
So what Anika skipped over was that Anika teaches the Economic and Community Development Clinic, Housing and Economic Development Clinic.
Well, I teach a couple of different clinics. So 2 of those clinics together, our housing clinic and our community and economic development clinic, both represent the plaintiffs in the case.
So the students in her clinics over the various years have done a lot of work on this case. It was first filed as a zoning application in the town of Woodbridge, and then it was approved without really being approved. It was really denied. And then it was filed as litigation last year. So her students over the years have done an enormous amount of work on this case. And one of the most fascinating pieces of work, I would say, is a zoning history of the town of Woodbridge, which was submitted to the town as part of the zoning application. And it really would turn your stomach. If you read it, I can make that available. It's only 40 pages, I think. just repeated efforts over many, many, many years to change the zoning for various projects in various locations. They were all turned down. What's the requested relief? It's in the complaint, which is
In the
public
complaint.
information.
We ask for simply, essentially, a declaratory judgment from the court that the zoning is in violation of law, we ask for some economic damages too, to my recollection.
And we asked as an interim step that they implement the zoning that we proposed, which was?
So as Richard has sort of alluded to, the idea is that within the same footprint of structure that the zoning permits today, you could build multiple units provided that some percentage of them were affordable, and that of course you comply with the building code, which unlike zoning is an objective health and safety code drafted by industry professionals.
As opposed to volunteers. So you alluded to the fact that there have been zoning reform efforts in other states. They passed an update to the statute in Massachusetts. They've passed zoning reform in California, which has been notoriously difficult place to build. So could you just kind of tell us some of the things that have happened in some other states?
Yeah, I mean, the state level zoning reforms that have taken place usually live in like maybe one of 3 or 4 different buckets. So one we've already talked about, 2 we've really already talked about, one of which is fair share, one of which is the 830G model, which is what you would call, it would sometimes get referred to as the builder's remedy model. Again, anti-SNAP zoning, much more descriptive. A third bucket is where a state will call out particular kinds of exclusionary zoning and simply make them illegal. So when we say state control, local control, this is a version of basically eliminating local control to enact certain kinds of zoning. So common examples are making it impermissible for towns to refuse to permit ADUs. So I know that's like a lot of words, but it's basically
ADU.
accessory dwelling units. So accessory dwelling units, you also heard the term granny flats, or the idea is that you can take a garage or you can build an additional structure in your backyard that is an accessory to the single family house that exists on your lot, and that's permitted as of right. So there are a number of states that as of today have made it as of right statewide permissible to attach an accessory dwelling unit to a single family house, include, from California to New Hampshire. In California, they actually expanded their accessory dwelling unit statute, so now you can build 2 ADUs on any single family lot in the state of California. Other examples are eliminating single family zoning entirely, putting a cap on minimum lot sizes, which is something Connecticut tried to do in the 60s actually, is make the maximum minimum lot size 1 acre. That failed.
Failed,
Yeah,
yes.
failed. And it actually empowered towns to go, so a lot of the 4-acre minimum lot zoning you see in the state of, like in northern Greenwich and stuff, only happened after that. The failure of the 1 acre was like, oh, well, if there's no limit,
Do anything we want.
Exactly. So that's one example. Another example that gives local governments a little bit more flexibility to kind of put things where they want to put them is something that Massachusetts did a couple years ago, which is a transit-oriented development bill, and it requires that every town designate a I think they call it like an area of substantial size, which they define as at least 50 acres. At least 50 acres, 50 acres or square miles?
Acres.
Acres, okay, so it's not that big. 50 acres somewhere in town where you permit at least 15, this whole city of New Haven is 25 square miles, so it can't be 50. So 50 acres where you permit a density of at least 15 units per acre as of right, so that you don't have to come in for permission, and you can't have any age restrictions, because one thing you do see a lot in suburban multifamily zoning is a requirement that it be for seniors, because seniors don't have children who are poor who might go to your schools. So that's another example out of Massachusetts, and there are a couple of places that have done things like that, saying, you know, we're not going to remove your ability to do single-family zoning, but you do have to put a real as-of-right multifamily zone somewhere in your town.
So looks like it's 25 after 7. So I think if anyone has any questions from the audience, we would be happy to answer them at this point. So, yep, right there.
I don't like the microphone.
Yeah, right here.
Okay. I just wondered, I know that since so many office buildings have cleared out, I see that that's such a ripe opportunity. Like, I live in subsidized housing myself, and that's such a ripe opportunity for people to move in. But I see the story that the Bank of America in Greenwich, they wanted to put 40 units, and they've got everybody hemming and hawing over 40, and then they go to Stanford and build like this thing for like 2,000 units. I mean, it just doesn't seem to add up. And I also wonder when I see stories about, oh, the traffic is too bad. I say, well, what about when it was a working bank? You know, I mean, I know, you know, putting lots of bathrooms and stuff, but still, 40 isn't that big, and it must have been carefully, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you are correct. I will say, you know, office to residential conversion, and Richard's done some, it isn't always super easy, particularly in newer commercial construction. So it in and of itself is not a solution. But yes, you know, for goodness sake, let's eat the low-hanging fruit. And if there's an office building capable of being converted at a reasonable cost to housing that's already constructed and likely in a place that is central, then we ought to be permitting much more of that. Oh, it's all of
zoning.
this. It's all the
It's
zoning.
all this.
Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Cynthia Bowser, and I've lived in Stanford all my life and on the west side. That's where the predominant number of low-income, nonprofit housing was constructed as a result of urban redevelopment. People have been leaving Stanford since urban redevelopment. And I understand last week there was a meeting at the Ferguson Library, the South End branch, which now the South End is now I think the median income there now for a family of 4 is $99,000. So what happens? Who qualifies for affordable housing? What is that definition? And I think that this has been very enlightening. But I'd like to have, for us in the city of Stanford, to have this conversation about what urban development has done, where we're going. You are displacing low-income people. You talked about Darien, New Canaan. We're doing the same thing here. So I think that this has been very, very enlightening, but I'd really like to see this discussion on a local level.
I don't think you're wrong, and I think that you know, Richard's right that to the extent that we've built any multifamily housing, we've done it in Stanfords and Norwalks and the New Havens of the state, and we can't solve the problem by continuing to, with those cities being the only places that continue to permit housing. But those cities also have to continue to permit housing. I mean, I think Richard would agree with me as a resident of Stanford, and I certainly feel that way as a resident of New Haven. We're not building enough housing in our cities to accommodate demand, to live in those places, and as a result, you do see displacement, and you do see prices rising because there's not enough supply. Now you cannot solve this problem by building in one or two places. It is a statewide problem, and I don't think there's ever going to be a whole lot of people and a whole lot of developers who want to build stuff in like the quiet corner, for example. But along the 95 and 91 corridors, we should be building housing everywhere, and we should be building it at all income levels, from the lowest, people who are making $0 can qualify for that housing, all the way up the market, so that the folks at the top of the market do not continue to displace people who are living at the bottom of the market.
Yeah, I mean, we just don't build enough housing. That's really the bottom line. I mean, it's not a statewide housing policy to focus all of your, as Anika referred to, Stamford and Norwalk, I believe, accounted for 40% of the population growth in Connecticut in the last 10 years. That's just not a workable economic formula. I vigorously agree that that Stamford specifically needs to continue to do what it's doing. I mean, we could give 3 presentations like the one we just had, just on Stamford zoning and land use, but it's really a statewide problem.
So I'd also like to ask a question about. I'd also like to ask a question about Stamford. In your views, when it comes to affordable housing, what is Stamford doing well, and what are our opportunities for improvement?
Well, we're a model for the rest of the state, and we have been for many decades. The first inclusionary zoning in Connecticut was passed in Stamford, I believe, in the early 1990s. So inclusionary zoning means that any project over 10 units that's constructed in Stamford must be at least 10% affordable units. So Westport, for example, requires 20% affordable. So you might say, oh, well, that's better. The problem is that in Westport, the way the zoning combines with the land use availability, you really can't build a project that's more than about 15 units. So you get 3 affordable units. Stamford has both inclusionary zoning and zoning that allows for construction of housing at scale. So if you build a 200-unit project, that's 20 units of affordable housing. So Stamford's actually created 600 units of affordable housing in about the last 10 years. That's way more, way, way, way more than any other municipality in the state. What could we be doing better? I think we could be making the housing available to a larger, to a deeper income level, right? Lower income levels than what we're doing now. Right now, the affordable housing is all targeted really at a more of a moderate income level, and I think if we had a sort of a ladder of various income levels that was required, I think that would address the problem more directly.
I hesitate to jump in as a non-local, but I suspect that another thing that gets at the segregation question is that you could be building more diverse array of housing in a larger number of neighborhoods. You don't have to apologize. Like I said, I think you're right. I also think you have to, not you personally have to, but I have to also consider the fact, like it's important to me to consider the fact that some of the forces that increase the cost of housing have to do with a lot of things, one of which is supply. So I don't know what the statistics in Stamford are, but I'll tell you what it's like in New Haven, and I suspect it's not dissimilar. There is a segment of the New Haven marketplace that is fairly well off. So we're talking the people who are like 60th to 80th percentile of incomes in New Haven who actually underpay for housing. So we talk a lot of times about people who overpay for housing. They pay more than 30% of their income on housing. There's a significant number of people in the city of New Haven who would likely be willing to pay more for housing if those units existed, right? Nicer units in neighborhoods that they liked. And instead, because that housing doesn't exist, because we didn't build it for such a long time, New Haven's only seeing sort of like increase in boon and market rate units over the last 5 to 10 years. They're actually living in housing that might otherwise be affordable to somebody who's lower income. They are displacing people who are low income because we haven't built the stuff that they want to live in, which we disparage as, you know, luxury apartments or whatever. We have to build that stuff too because they have to have somewhere to go. The people who currently live in those market rate South End apartments didn't like pop up out of nowhere because the apartments were built. They're people who were already in this region and were looking for somewhere to live. And if it weren't there, they would have found someplace else because those are people with money. The people with money are always going to win this conversation. You have to build the housing at all of the income levels. And we have underproduced at every single bracket, at every single income bracket. But who ends up getting hurt are the people at the bottom. So yes, like this is a conversation we have to have, but to lay the problem at the feet of new construction, I think, is exactly the wrong place to put the blame. I think the person who's standing up, good.
First, I'd like to thank you, Professor Lamar, for, I believe some of your students published on the Stanford zoning petition process. I thought that was a very illuminating piece of writing. I wanted to bring up something that I think this presentation hasn't covered yet, and I'm a little surprised. I'm one of the people who is crazy enough to show up to zoning board meetings, and the two top complaints you get when any new construction is discussed are traffic and parking. And of course, those are forces that are kind of in opposition. The more parking you build, the more traffic you cause. But people want always more parking, more parking, more parking. So I was wondering, especially with your role in building affordable housing, if you could talk about your experience dealing with local parking minimums and requirements.
Parking requirements are they're a cog in the exclusionary discriminatory zoning constellation. Parking requirements are a big one. So, for example, I think in Fairfield, if you build a 2-bedroom apartment, I think the requirement is for 3 parking spaces. So, well, the beauty of 830G is you get to determine, you don't have to adhere to the zoning, so you get to actually park the building properly. For the most part in Stamford, I would say the parking requirements are more or less accurate. Overparking is just it's an ecological disaster. I've had this discussion more than once with the zoning board here, actually, for the deeply affordable housing, which if you build more parking, you can't put as much building on. And so the point I made to them successfully was, are we building parking or are we building housing? So if we're building parking, we're gonna get less housing. And if we build more housing and we end up coming up short on parking for some reason in the heart of downtown, so people will park in a garage, or they'll park in the Target garage, or they'll park in a municipal garage. So I think parking is, it's just, I've had it come up at almost every 830G hearing. The zoning board will accuse me of underparking the building, and then I have to spend lots of money to hire traffic engineers to do studies and demonstrate it and put numbers together from our other buildings to show that we have the right amount of parking. Traffic, why don't you, maybe you should take traffic.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not a...
Also comes up at every zoning hearing.
Yeah, and I'm not a traffic engineer, but there is, when you're looking development by development, what you end up doing is you measure the traffic proximate to that development. And yes, like adding 200 people to a location is probably going to add some traffic. I mean, it's undeniably true that you have more people now. And what zoning does not do, it could, but what it doesn't do is require or enable anyone to look at regional patterns. So will putting a new building in downtown Stamford increase traffic, or near the train station in New Canaan increase traffic in that location? Yeah, I mean, maybe, right? Like, we live in Connecticut, people have cars, whatever. Even if they didn't, they'd call an Uber every once in a while. Yeah, would it increase traffic? Probably. But will it increase traffic regionally? Probably not. You're giving people an option for a place to live that they did not previously have. And most of us do not choose to live like gazillion miles from the places where we go, right? You normally choose to live close to where you work, close to where your kids go to school, close to where you like to shop. And if you had more options, you would likely decrease the miles that you're required to travel in order to get to those things. So if we thought about traffic regionally, then more housing opportunities are not going to increase traffic. They're going to decrease traffic because you're giving people options to live close to where they want to be. But sure, if all you're looking at is the traffic light at the corner of, you know, Maple and State Streets or whatever, like that you personally sit at every morning on your way to work, and you're the person who shows up to the planning and zoning hearing, you know, for the reasons we described earlier, then all anybody's looking at is traffic in this very, very limited definition. You think about it for half a second, you're like, that's a really weird way to talk about traffic. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. Two quick questions. I'll keep them very brief out of respect for everyone else. What is the legal definition of affordable housing in Stamford? Because without that, we can't have a meaningful conversation.
Let me start at a general level, and then maybe I don't actually know what the Stanford ordinance is. So when I talk to my students about affordable housing, I say we're talking about two things. We're talking about capital A affordable housing, which typically benefits from some government subsidy somewhere along the way, or some government program like the inclusionary zoning program that Richard described. That's like capital A affordable housing, like there's a law somewhere that mandates that housing be affordable. And typically what that means is that the housing can only be occupied by people who make below a certain income. That could be 80% of area median income, it can be 60%, it can be 40%, whatever percentage the statute sets. And the folks who live there should not be paying more than 30% of their income in order to live there. That's capital A affordable housing. But the vast majority of poor people, like 80% of poor people, don't live in capital A affordable housing. They live in market rate housing. They live in housing that charges whatever the heck they want to whoever the heck they want to rent or sell to. And some number of those people live in what I call lowercase a affordable housing, which is housing that just happens to be cheap and affordable to them. So when we talk about like what does the law have to do with affordable housing? Well, it has to do with all of them, right? So there's laws that mandate or permit capital A affordable housing, and then there's ways in which the law makes it very, very difficult to build lowercase a affordable housing, which is again where 80% of low-income people actually reside.
So again, in Stamford, what is considered affordable?
So for the purposes of what? For the purposes of a subsidy? For the purposes of inclusionary zoning?
Just to have a conversation about. I mean, there has to be a definition of affordable housing.
But there's 17 different conversations one
Okay.
could have. Do you want to have a conversation about how to subsidize affordable housing? Do you want to have a conversation about whether zoning permits affordable housing? Like, what's the conversation? What's your second question?
Okay. Income, I mean, and prices of houses versus median income or whatever. I mean, there has to be a ground.
There's a definition in the zoning, but the definition in the zoning is an affordable unit is 50% of the area median income. That's the income limit, which is the area median income is 170,000, and so 50% of that is 85,000. And you adjust it for unit size, 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom, studio, 3-bedroom, that number goes up, goes down. That's the standard definition of an affordable unit under our zoning, but as Anika said, that's just one definition in one place in our zoning.
Okay, all right. To continue on, to touch on one or two things that this lady over here said before, it's easy to single out and say New Canaan, Darien, Westport, they don't want this, they don't want, but it's not just that, okay? We live in Springdale, okay, which is a very integrated community. Everyone gets along very, very well. And several months ago, when I believe your company, Richard, wanted to develop the parcel across the street from the Springdale School for affordable housing. And my wife and I were walking in our neighborhood in Springdale, and some woman who we didn't know came up to us and said, "Did you hear what they're trying to do there? They're trying to do affordable housing. There's going to be crime, there's going to be drug dealing, prostitution." And we didn't engage in that conversation, but it's that kind of intrinsic pushback, and it's not just wealthy communities. But my specific question, how did that go? How hard was it to get that project done? Is it fully occupied, and how did it turn out?
You're absolutely right. I mean, the reason I think both of us keep singling out New Canaan and Darien is because it's universal across the entire town. There's nowhere really anywhere in those towns where you can build multifamily at scale, which is not the case here in Stamford. That doesn't mean that you don't have neighborhood opposition in Stamford, and I had a significant amount on that project in Springdale. I was actually just reviewing some of those documents the other day, and some of the things that were said were bothersome. The project received zoning approval a couple of years ago, and we just received our CO a month ago, and it's fully occupied. The rents are between about $700 a month and $1,300 a month. For the lowest rent would be for a 2-bedroom. At the lowest income level, the highest rent would be for a 3-bedroom at the highest income level, which is, I think, $80,000 a year is the highest income level, and the lowest income level is about $40,000. We had a ribbon cutting. The mayor was there. It was really a nice day, and it's fully occupied. And it's named after our former mayor, David Martin.
You talked about the stick. What are ways that we could push the state toward offering carrots in a way of sort of whether enacting, affordability in perpetuity, higher percentages in 830G, different things like that. I mean, ADUs, you can build them, but people do not want to deed restrict them to be affordable in those towns. So you can build them. Maybe it takes offload some people that want to move into the other, but they're not necessarily going to be affordable, and they're not going to count toward what the state's counting. How can we push the state to incentivize developers to increase their percentages and to possibly even extend beyond 40 years into affordability in perpetuity?
I don't care whether an ADU is deed restricted, and I'll tell you why. Because nobody is enforcing that deed restriction. It doesn't matter. So deed restriction just means you file a piece of paper on the land record saying that this is going to be treated as affordable housing in the capital A sense, enforcing an income restriction on every tenant and a rent amount restriction on every landlord. Give me a break, right? So Trumbull deed restricted a bunch of ADUs a number of years ago for reasons, again, that are like way too in the weeds to deal with. And I straight up asked the deputy commissioner for housing in the state, I said, "Mike, like, how do you know poor people are actually living?" He's like, I don't know. Nobody, they're not, what? Their mother-in-laws are living there. Like, don't give me a break. Like, that's not, I don't care whether you deed restrict ADUs. It's simply additional supply. That's what it is.
And it's little a, because they don't have concierges, swimming pools, rooftop decks, right? You don't have that in an
It's
ADU.
lowercase a affordable housing, and we desperately need lowercase a affordable housing. I don't care whether they're deed restricted. Now, your second question about increasing for, this is like 830G weeds. So 830G today, you can use if your development is 30% affordable. It used to be 20%. We already increased that because the town said that that's what they wanted. And the deed restriction's 40 years? 40 years. Yeah, okay, thank you. You can increase that percentage, but as Richard's already said, percentage of what? Right? So inclusionary zoning's great, and Stamford's had it for years, New Haven just did it. what it is, and what the 830G percentage is as well, is a tax that funds affordable housing on the backs of new construction. Existing homeowners don't pay that tax. I, in my home in New Haven, do not pay that tax. The people who live in new units built 2 blocks down from me, they pay that tax, but I don't. There's no good reason to exempt me from that tax, but I'm exempted. The only people who have to pay it are the people who live in new construction and their landlords. Taxes depress the thing that you're taxing. You get when you tax a thing, you get less of the thing that you're taxing. I don't want less new construction. 80% of poor people live in market rate housing. And everybody else lives in market rate housing too. I don't want less market rate housing because then I'm depressing supply and then I'm increasing prices. And that's just bad. So 30% is pretty darn high. I mean, it's kind of crazy high, actually.
Well, that's actually, we really didn't discuss this when we were talking about 830G. That's one of the reasons 830G isn't used much. Yeah,
We actually
it's
should have said that. Yeah, that's
it's because the 30% is very high.
So that's one set of things. Those changes to 830G would decrease affordable housing. It's not something I'm looking to do. And I know maybe we should stop picking on the West. So I'll say,
No, keep picking on them.
Guilford doesn't need your carrots. Like, they do not need them. They are fine, right? So you sometimes will see state level zoning reform that says, well, you're not eligible for this infrastructure money from the state if you don't build enough affordable housing. And Marin County, I'll even leave the state, is like, cool, I don't need it. Like, we did a really good job of making sure only rich people could live here. So we don't need your pennies coming out of Sacramento, right? And we have similar stuff going on in Connecticut. So I just, who needs carrots when you're already on dessert? I'm not seeing it.
Last question.
Thank you. This is kind of a very local question, but earlier this week, somebody came through our neighborhood and pasted a poster on every porch with all the reasons why the project on Long Ridge Road should not go through. I don't have any idea who did this, but maybe you could update us about what's going on with that project.
I mean, I'm just kind of a gadfly on this one. I mean, actually, Representative Carl Weinberg from the 20th District. Okay, so yeah, so go on Nextdoor. Carl has been intimately involved in this. I mean, from the 35,000 feet level, it's kind of more, more of the same things that we see in other towns are here. This is related to the question about Springdale, right? It's not just because we're in Stamford and we do a good job building affordable housing doesn't mean that we're not exempt from these kinds of reactions to housing, especially in northern parts of the city, what I would call a northern part of the city. Well, yeah, so the project that I built in Springdale that I referenced before, it's 17 units of all ages, family housing, deeply affordable housing is the not term of art we use here in Stamford. And it's the first project of that type not built, basically south of Broad Street. So not on the east side or the west side or in the south end. So obviously it's the first one in Springdale, but it's far larger area of Stamford. It's the first project of its type. Here we are in 2023. It's the first project of that type ever built in Stamford. And Stamford has a pretty sordid history of discriminatory zoning.